what caught my eye is that he's got some really interesting practical shilas that I think we can sink our teeth into. And I just wanted to start with a few words from his Hakdama, which gives us encouragement to study the laws of Choshen Mishpat once again. So we may not go through every single tshuva in the Sefer, but it is divided into different sections. And I hope that we'll be able to get some really interesting halacha l'maisa from it. And the first section, this really I just wanted to go through the Hakdama. He had already written a sefer called Baruch Omer on Orach Chaim, and now he's produced this version on Choshen Mishpat. So he says, V'hinei, this is on the bottom of page 12 from the packet. Inyan zeh shalimud inyanei Choshen Mishpat v'dinei mamon is chashuv hu ad ma'od. He says, studying Choshen Mishpat halacha and the laws, monetary laws, is very important. Shomeret HaGemara, as the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Haiman deboy lemihavi chasida l'kayim milei dinizikin. That Rav Yehuda, and we had studied this before in when we learned the introduction to Imrei Yaakov a few years ago. He also quoted this very same Gemara. A person who desires to be a pious individual should fulfill the halachos of nizikin, of damages. The lichora kasha, and the question that many of the commentaries ask is, v'chi midat chasidut hi shelo lahazik et chaveiro. Is it considered an act of piety to avoid damaging my friend's property and compensating him when I break his window? Okay, am I a pious individual just because I know what I'm supposed to do? If anything, if I deliberately cause damage to my fellow, I'm a bad person. Why then do they say that if you want to be pious, you should fulfill the words of damages, or the law of damages? Piresh Maran Hachida Besifro Petach Einayim, Ki yesh b'nei adam shemitchasdim b'inyanim sheben adam lamakom. The Chida Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, a great Kabbalist of the 18th century. I think 18th or 9th, I don't remember, but he explained that there are many people who have sort of manifest piety when it comes to areas of observance bein adam lamakom, between themselves and Hashem. Nisarim mikol chet va'avon v'nishmarim mikol chashash isur. They're very careful not to do anything wrong from a halachic standpoint. Mahadrim b'mitzvot u'medaktikim b'hem va'ovdim et Hashem b'chol livam. They're very, very meticulous in all of their observance, and they serve God fervently. Avol b'dinei mamanis shebein adam l'chaveiro einam nisarim keroi. But when it comes to monetary issues, they're not as careful. Lefichach ba Rav Yehuda lahazhir otam. He says, and that's who Rav Yehuda was coming to speak to. He's speaking to the very, very pious individual who takes a lot of extra time with his tefillah, who's shushing everybody who's talking, who is very, very careful to accept Shabbos early and to make Havdalah late, and do all of the things that a pious individual is supposed to do. Sha'adam kazeh inenu chasid ad sheyidakdek v'yakpid heitev gam b'dinei mamanis. He says that kind of person is not really pious unless he is also careful in monetary issues. Shelo yifga b'mamon chavero shelo kedim, not to intrude on someone else's property or financial interests against halacha. Sheyikayim milei denizikan al kol prateim v'dikdukeim v'rak az yechashev lechasid. Only when a person is fulfilling monetary law to the T, then and only then will he be a chassid. So, in other words, You may speak to a fellow and he may pride himself, maybe not verbally, but prides himself on being very, very pious, wears the right clothes, shows up at the right times to all of the different things that he's supposed to show up to demonstrate that he's very, very frum. But if he's not careful in this particular area, he's not a chassid. Uve'emet hadavar matsui, sheyesh anashim yirei shamayim hanizharim b'halachot hamitzuyot, umedakdekim bekala kebachamura. He says, unfortunately, this is actually something that is quite prevalent, that there are people who are God-fearing Jews, are very careful in halacha, and uvechol zot b'dinei mamonut lo makpidim maspik, but they're not sufficiently careful when it comes to financial halacha. V'hasiba lakach, he says, and the reason for that is kevan shelo yodim heitev et hadidim v'halachot, is because they simply are ignorant of the fact that there is an entire section of law that addresses monetary halacha. And without knowing the halacha, it's impossible to be careful. As the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, Ein bor yirechet velo am haaretz chasid, that a bor, an ignorant person, cannot be fearful of sin, and similarly an am haaretz, which is also, again, a person who's illiterate, cannot be pious. The achein, so if you don't know what that there is such a halacha, then how can you possibly address it? The achein Rav Yehuda hishpia al b'nei doro sheyaspegu yoter b'dinei mamanis sheben adam lechavero v'yubikim b'seder nizikin. And that's why Rav Yehuda made his sort of declaration, because he was trying to prevail upon his colleagues, the members of his generation, that this was something that they needed to sort of brush up on, so that they would know how to be careful in this area. And this actually was a successful endeavor, as the Gemara records, that in Rav Yehuda's generation, everyone studied Nezikin. And it's quite interesting because one of the curricular sort of core masechtos that many children study or young men study in yeshiva are the bavas, bava kama, bava metzia, bava basra. The only problem is that they don't learn it necessarily halacha lemaisa. When I first learned Elu Metzias and Shnai Mochzin and all of the Brakim and Bava Kama, they were intellectually challenging, right? And we studied them for their lumdus, for the difficulty in mental acrobatics, but we didn't learn it from a halachic standpoint about what to do when you find someone's object and what the halachic obligations are. So this is very important, is that it's not just enough to study the Gemara, you have to study the halacha. He says they are, however, very deep and very broad. And one of the things that you and I have discovered together is that there's a huge amount of gray area when it comes to Choshen Mishpat. It's not like learning Mishnah Brura, where, it tells you exactly how to shake the lulav, okay? There's a lot of gray area because real life cases are not neat and ritualistic to know exactly what to do. So it's a very different kind of halacha as well from standard Orach Chaim halacha. Kemoshe Shaninu b'Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yishmael, Arotza Shiachkim Yasok b'Dinei Mamanis. And this is also taught in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yishmael was quoted as saying that if a person wishes to become wise, he should engage in monetary law. She'en lecha mikzoa v'torah yoter mehen v'hein kemayan hanoveya. There is no subject that is more important or I guess more rich and they are like a constantly replenishing wellspring. Below rabim heim hazochim lilmod choshen mishpat karoi ad hahalacha l'maisa. And he says, there are not a lot of people who engage in this study to know really halachically what to do. Aval hahalachot hanilmadot mishulchan aruch choshen mishpat nogaot ma'od l'ma'aseh. Despite the fact that these are very relevant to real life halachic issues. V'chol adam nitkal bahem b'chayei hayom yom. And people, unfortunately, fail to observe these halachas on a daily basis. Lefichach mutelet hachova al kol adam lilmod dinei mamonut hanogeim l'ma'aseh. Therefore, it's incumbent upon every person to know these halachos, to know how to react when a shaila comes to his attention. Okay, and then he does his acknowledgments, and then that's it. And he continues along his acknowledgement. His friends, his gaboyim, his patrons. Okay, and he also prays to Hashem that it should find its mark. Okay, so let's just learn the first shaila. Just spend the next 3 minutes. Samchus bote hadin bizmanenu. The reliability or how we're supposed to rely upon a beis din nowadays. Very practical. Ha'im hasamchut shel within the last 10 years. Let me just see where this is, page 15. So this is Tafshin Ayin Zayin, which is, when is that? Ayin Zayin, we're now in Pei Dalid, so it's 7 years ago. This was published. Okay. It would be 2017, I guess, right? Okay. Ha'im hasamchut shel batei din b'yameinu kesamchut batei din shebizman Moshe Rabbeinu. Can we rely on the batei din today in the way that they were relied upon in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu? So he says, Tshuva amnam amru chazal, our sages teach us, yiftach b'doro kishmul b'doro, that every generation has its own leaders, and Yiftach in his generation, even though Yiftach was not, let's say, the greatest of religious leaders in the annals of Jewish history, because he was a flawed human being, nonetheless, because he manifested in his generation, he was all that generation had. And therefore, as our sages tell us, he was as important to his generation as Shmuel, the great Navi, was to his generation. Mikol makom le'inyan koach batei hadin ladun yesh hevdel gadol bein zman Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom lizmanenu. But there still is a very important distinction that needs to be made between the batei din as they existed in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu and the batei din as they exist in modern times. He says, because in order for someone to properly preside over a beis din, whether it deals with dinei nefashos, which are capital cases where a person could potentially be put to death for being judged, or whether it has to do with monetary law, Utzarech lekabel semicha kamo shamatzinu shemina Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom et Yehoshua lechahein kemanhig acharav. And this type of smicha was given by Moshe to his disciple Yehoshua. And therefore, God commanded Moshe, v'samachta et yadcha alav, dahainu sheyeh musmach v'tiyelo harsha ladun. And that is literally placing the hands of the teacher on the student to give him that authority. Today, what we call smicha is not really smicha, type of smicha that existed in biblical times or even Talmudic times. And we'll have to continue this in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. Okay. Take care, everybody. Have a good day. Let's hear good news.